Welcome to Black Spring. After a whirlwind of tension and riots across the nation this week, we will take a turn in this segment to vet a potential VP from the former Vice President Biden's shortlist. As you may have heard, Joe Biden is expected to reveal a VP candidate, the first woman. Now, during this auspicious occasion, some of the base of the Democrat Party or loyal constituents have a very specific expectation for Biden to consider. In an interview with the Breakfast Club's host, Charlemagne the God, Charlemagne discloses the faction of the Black community that expects his choice to include a Black woman for the ticket. In fact, the host went on to say that due to the generational effects of the Clinton Biden 94 crime bill, that the 2016 presidential nominee Hillary Clinton of the Democrat Party would purportedly atone for the damage if elected. Now, that brings me to our very first part of this segment. In this segment, we will take a look at Joe Biden's VP shortlist. And that on this segment includes Senator Elizabeth Warren of Massachusetts. And we'll also be taking a look at her voting record as a part of the civic literacy on this segment. Once again, I'd like to thank everyone for joining me on this segment of Black Spring. Now, for this segment, we will be taking a look at a source that tells a different side of the potential candidate's profile and background. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to thank you for joining me on this segment of Black Spring with Autumn. This comes from The Atlantic. The story Elizabeth Warren isn't telling. The progressive senator doesn't talk about her Republican past, should she? Now, this was written by Russell Berman, January 10th of 2020. Katrina Cochran can still remember clearly how her friend Liz Herring would needle about her liberal politics when the two would sit next to each other at Northwest Clawson High School in Oklahoma and during the years after. Quote, besides the Democratic Party, end quote, Herring, whose success on the debate team would win her a college scholarship, would say, quote, what other subversive organizations are you a member of? A half century later, Liz Herring is now Elizabeth Warren, and she's running for the presidential nomination of the party she once derided. Warren's upbringing in Oklahoma is a major part of her stump speech. She talks about how her father's poor health forced her mother into the workforce in the 1960s and nearly cost the family their house. How she married at 19 and lost her first teaching job after she became pregnant. How her Aunt Bee saved her when she was struggling to balance the demands of motherhood and her burgeoning career in academia. She discusses her 3 older brothers, making sure to note that all of them were in the military and that the 2 of them are Republicans. What Warren rarely, if ever, mentions, however, is that during this entire formative period of her adult life, she herself was a conservative. Quote, she was very against a lot of governmental controls, end quote. Cochran, who remained close with Warren through her 20s, told me, quote, she thought people should have the right to make all the money they could. Among longtime liberals, Warren's political history could present a liability as the race nears its first votes. Unlike some of her top rivals, she cannot claim to have been fighting in the trenches of a progressive politics for decades, yet the very fact could, at the same time, be appealing to less ideological voters who may know little about Warren's biography from before she burst onto the national political scene. Hers is the story of a convert, not a zealot. The decision to become a Democrat was anything but a default choice. She came to it only after years of study that challenged her more conservative assumptions about how the economy and the government worked. And as Warren seeks to expand beyond her liberal base, that rarely mined part of her past could serve as a comfort to Democrats who worry about her electability or as a point of connection with independents and moderate Republicans who may not know that. For a long time, she was actually one of them. Warren has this in common with the previous Democratic presidential nominee, Hillary Clinton. Just 2 years older than Warren, famously began her political life as a, quote, Goldwater girl in high school in the 1960s. But while Clinton's flirtation with the right was brief, Warren's was not. Though she was not politically active well into the 80s, Warren was espousing the views of an ascendant conservative legal movement that championed free markets over the intervention of government regulation. Her colleagues from the time told me, in scholarly papers and policy debates with her law school comrades, Warren regularly took the side of corporations over consumers. Quote, she drank the Kool-Aid. She definitely believed in that, end quote, recalled Calvin Johnson, a law professor at the University of Texas at Austin and a former neighbor and a commuting buddy of Warren's. Though Warren's views began to shift in the mid-80s, she did not become a Democrat until 1995, when she was 46 years old. She was, in comparison to her top rivals in the presidential race, a Johnny-come-lately to the progressivism. By the time Warren finally made her switch, Joe Biden had already run for president on once and spent a quarter century as a Democrat representing Delaware in the Senate. And while Bernie Sanders in the early 90s was fighting as a member of the House for a, quote, national health insurance program, like the one Warren is now embracing, she was still a registered member of the party that successfully defeated it. It's hardly surprising that Warren wouldn't broadcast her history of economic conservatism as she tries to win over a primary electorate full of progressives. And so far, Warren's rivals haven't brought it up directly. Instead, they've lightly criticized her past work for corporate clients. But with the contest intensifying, it may be only a matter of time until Warren's fellow Democrats weaponize her GOP history. And once again, I'd like to thank everyone for joining me on this segment of Black Spring with Autumn. Now, as I stated previously, we will go on and take a look at the voting record of Senator Elizabeth Warren. I thank everybody for joining me on this segment of Black Spring with Autumn. Now here, as we've done in other casts, you have the voting record. This is the Freedom Index. This is a congressional scorecard based on constitutional principles. Now here we have the profile of candidate Elizabeth Warren. Of course, we will not go through all of the components or the scoring system. You can do that at your leisure, but I just at least would like to introduce you to the components in which a senator or a House representative may be evaluated on based on the oath that they take, which is the oath of the Constitution. Now, according to this is Senator Elizabeth Warren, Democrat of Massachusetts. She has a cumulative freedom score of 17%. Now, I don't know about you, but if I were in school, I don't think that a 17% would quite represent me as a constitutional voter or a constitutionally conscious servant in this case. Now we'll just take a brief look through here. Of course, Senator Warren is an active member of the Senate. And this is, of course, the record in which she has voted on. Of course, I will tell you generally that these components in which they are evaluated on, it's based on fiscal responsibility, avoiding foreign entanglements, less spending. Of course, that would be the fiscal responsibility. You have here, you have the short-term appropriations. You can see what they're being evaluated on here. You can take your time and go through this list yourself. So Elizabeth seems to vote pretty fiscally irresponsible on this measure here. So you can take your time and go through this at your leisure. You can see how she's voting, and you can also check out some of the values in which are included in these components. You can find out what constitutes a good vote, what the standards are, and what constitutes a not so good vote, based on the oath and the values and the principles of the Constitution. And once again, in these matters, I'd like to thank everyone for joining me on this segment of Black Spring with Autumn. Now, as always, we've seen, of course, many different spectrums of the Democratic nominees, and now that we're getting down to the wire, there are many expectations, of course, for the short list or for the candidates on that short list. And I tell you, you decide. Is it possible that Elizabeth Warren has been overcompensating with her imagination and her choices of padding maybe even her profile as a Democratic nominee? And why is that happening? Is it because she was a bit of a late bloomer, or there was a stigma to her switching her views, her late switch in her views, her political views, her representation? Or is Elizabeth Warren not quite the candidate that you have in mind? Of course, you can decide for yourself. And here on Black Spring, as always, we always like to keep in mind what actually matters most. What are your values? What do you value the most? Let me know what you think in the comments and your concerns. And if you could hit the like or the unlike or the subscribe button, or even hit that notification bell to stay in tune during these times. I'd like to thank everybody for joining me on this segment of Black Spring with Autumn.